March 17, 1943. Bay of Biscay, 3:47 hours. The steel walls of U-532 groaned as she cut through the black Atlantic waters, diesel engines rumbling like distant thunder beneath the deck plates. Kapitänleutnant Ottoheinrich Junker stood in the conning tower, salt spray stinging his face, scanning the horizon through Zeiss binoculars that had cost the Reich more than a factory worker earned in 6 months. The night was moonless, perfect. Above him, stars scattered across the void like shrapnel frozen in time. The air tasted of oil and brine and something else, something he couldn't name but had learned to recognize over 18 months of patrol. Dread, perhaps, or inevitability. His boat was 7 days out from Lorient, hunting in the mid-Atlantic gap where Allied air cover supposedly couldn't reach. The intelligence briefings had been clear. Between Greenland and Iceland, between Britain and Newfoundland, there existed a black hole in enemy surveillance, a killing ground where German submarines could surface safely, recharge batteries, breathe. Junker had believed it once. Every U-boat commander had. Now, standing in the darkness with his hand resting on the cold steel of the bridge combing, he believed in nothing except the mathematics of survival. 2 years earlier, the odds had favored the hunter. Now, the hunted counted hours. In the cramped control room below, 43 men waited in silence broken only by the rhythmic ping of the hydrophone and the whisper of nervous breathing. They smelled of unwashed bodies and diesel fumes, of fear fermented in recycled air. Some carved wooden models to pass the time. Others wrote letters they knew might never be mailed. One young machinist from Hamburg had stopped eating 3 days ago, his eyes vacant, staring at bulkheads that seemed to compress with every passing hour. Junker had seen it before, the psychological collapse that came when men realized they were fighting an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't hear, couldn't understand. And then it came, not a sound, not a warning, just sudden, blinding light splitting the darkness like the hand of an angry god reaching down from heaven. White phosphorescent brilliance flooded the conning tower, turning night into noon, shadows into bone-stark clarity. Junker's pupils contracted violently. His night vision, painstakingly cultivated over 40 minutes of darkness, vanished in an instant. Above the roar of wind and engines, he heard the unmistakable drone of aircraft engines growing louder, closer, hunting. Alarm, his voice cracked across the bridge. Dive, dive, dive. Klaxons shrieked. Men scrambled. The bridge watch tumbled through the hatch as seawater began flooding the ballast tanks with a roar-like avalanche. Junker was the last down, pulling the hatch closed as the ocean reached up to claim his boat. Through the thick steel, he heard the whistle of falling bombs, the concussive hammer blows of depth charges detonating close, too close, shaking U-532 like a child's toy in a bathtub. Light bulbs shattered. Cork insulation rained from the overhead. A young rating vomited into a bucket, hands shaking. They survived. This time. But as Junker stood in the control room afterward, watching his crew's haunted eyes, listening to their ragged breathing, he understood what the intelligence officers in Paris and Berlin refused to acknowledge. The rules of the game had changed. The Atlantic was no longer a hunting ground. It had become an abattoir. For 3 years, Germany's U-boat arm had been the Third Reich's most potent weapon against Britain. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Starve the island nation into submission by severing the maritime lifelines that sustained her. Every convoy sunk, every merchant ship sent to the bottom, represented tons of food, fuel, ammunition, and hope that would never reach British shores. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, had calculated that sinking 700,000 tons of Allied shipping per month would force Churchill to negotiate. In the early years, those numbers had been achievable. More than achievable, they'd been exceeded. The so-called happy time of 1940 and 1941 saw German submarines prowling virtually unopposed, their commanders returning to French ports as heroes, their conning towers painted with victory pennants, Their crews celebrated with champagne and oak leaf clusters. But by 1943, the mathematics of warfare had inverted. U-boat losses were climbing exponentially, while merchant sinkings declined. Something had changed in the Allied arsenal, something that transformed the vast emptiness of the Atlantic from protective cover into a hunting ground where German submarines were the prey. That something was radar. To understand what German U-boat commanders thought about Allied radar requires understanding what they initially refused to believe about it. The technology itself wasn't new. German scientists had developed their own radar systems before the war. But there existed a fundamental psychological block within the Kriegsmarine High Command, a cognitive dissonance between what was technically possible and what seemed practically achievable. How could radio waves, invisible and intangible, detect a submarine in the vastness of the ocean? How could aircraft, flying at hundreds of kilometers per hour through darkness and weather, locate a target offering less than 200 square meters of surface area? The mathematics seemed impossible. The implications were unthinkable, so they denied it. German U-boat commanders returning from patrol in late 1941 and early 1942 reported inexplicable attacks. Aircraft appearing from nowhere in conditions where visual detection should have been impossible. Bombs falling from night skies without warning. Convoys altering course hours before submarines could reach attack positions, as if guided by supernatural prescience. The patrol reports accumulated in headquarters filing cabinets, each one describing the same phenomenon in different waters. The Allies were finding them when they shouldn't be findable. Captain Zur C. Gunther Hessler, Dernitz's son-in-law and staff operations officer, reviewed the reports with growing unease. One commander described being caught on the surface during a moonless night with visibility less than 500 meters. Another reported being attacked while submerged at periscope depth, his scope exposed for less than 90 seconds. A third detailed how a convoy escort had turned directly toward his position despite maintaining radio silence and perfect stealth. The pattern was undeniable. The conclusion was unavoidable. The Allies could see in the dark, but Dernitz resisted. His resistance wasn't born of stupidity or ignorance. He was among the most capable naval commanders in German service. Rather, it stemmed from something deeper, the existential threat that advanced Allied radar represented to his entire strategic concept. If the enemy could detect surfaced submarines at night, the fundamental premise of U-boat warfare collapsed. Submarines needed to surface regularly to run their diesel engines, recharge batteries, and transit at meaningful speeds. Submerged, they were blind, slow, vulnerable. The entire operational doctrine depended on the protective cloak of darkness and the vastness of the ocean. If that cloak had been stripped away, if the ocean had become transparent, then every submarine at sea was already condemned. Psychological defense mechanisms emerged. German naval intelligence suggested the attacks were coincidence, or betrayed by radio transmissions, or spotted by observers with exceptional vision. When those explanations became untenable, they proposed that the Allies had developed infrared detection systems that could see the heat signature of diesel exhaust. They theorized about acoustic detection devices that could hear submarine engines from dozens of kilometers away. They grasped at any explanation except the correct one, that British and American scientists had miniaturized radar systems to the point where they could be mounted on aircraft and escort vessels, and that these systems could detect a submarine's conning tower from distances that made escape impossible. The truth revealed itself slowly, painfully, through the accumulated testimony of survivors and the increasing lethality of Allied attacks. By mid-1943, U-boat losses had become catastrophic. In May alone, 41 submarines were destroyed, more than one per day, an attrition rate that couldn't be sustained. For every merchant ship sunk, a U-boat was lost. The exchange ratio had become suicidal. Korvettenkapitän Peter Kremer, commander of U-333, described the transformation in his memoir with bitter clarity. He had begun the war believing in the invincibility of the submarine, the invisible predator, the ghost ship that struck without warning and vanished without trace. By 1943, he wrote, every patrol had become an exercise in sustained terror. Surfacing at night meant Russian roulette with aircraft. Remaining submerged meant slow suffocation as batteries drained and air fouled. There were no good options, only gradations of risk measured in minutes of survival. The psychological impact on commanders was profound and measurable. Before 1943, the average U-boat captain was 26 years old, aggressive, confident, trained to take initiative and press attacks home regardless of danger. By late 1943, commanders were hesitating, breaking off attacks, diving at the slightest provocation. Dönitz noticed it in their patrol reports, the careful hedging, the defensive language, the justifications for caution. He issued increasingly strident orders demanding aggression, threatening courts-martial for cowardice, invoking duty and honor and the Führer's confidence. But no amount of exhortation could restore what radar had taken. The psychological advantage of the unseen hunter. What did German U-boat commanders really think about Allied radar? The answer evolved through stages of grief. First came denial, as comfortable and protective as the lies men tell themselves in the face of unbearable truth. Radar couldn't possibly work at sea. The waves would create too much clutter, the salt air would degrade the signals, the curvature of the earth would limit range. These were technical men, engineers and navigators who understood physics. They calculated ranges and frequencies, and concluded that effective airborne radar was years away from practical deployment. They were wrong, but wrongness provided comfort. Then came anger, directed outward at the Allied scientists who developed the technology and inward at German intelligence services that had failed to predict it. Commanders returned from patrol raging about unfair tactics, about technology that violated some unwritten code of naval warfare, as if war had rules beyond survival. They complained that radar made the Atlantic ungentlemanly, as if combat had ever been anything other than murder dressed in uniform. The anger was impotent and they knew it, which made it burn hotter. Bargaining followed. German engineers rushed to develop detection equipment that could warn submarines of radar emissions. The Metox device, introduced in late 1942, gave U-boats the ability to detect radar pulses before the radar could accurately locate them. For a few brief months, commanders felt a surge of hope. They could hear the enemy searching, could dive before being spotted. The technological balance seemed to shift back toward equilibrium, but the Allies adapted. They developed centimetric radar operating on wavelengths the Metox couldn't detect. They refined their tactics, approaching from down-moon positions where even visual detection was difficult. They coordinated aircraft and surface vessels in hunter-killer groups that bracketed areas so completely that escape became mathematical improbability. For every German countermeasure, the Allies had a countermeasure developed faster, deployed wider, employed more ruthlessly. Depression set in like fog through an open hatch. Kapitän Herbert Werner, one of the few commanders to survive the war, wrote that by 1944, every departure from port carried the knowledge that return was unlikely. Crews no longer discussed their next leave. They spoke instead of whether death would come from depth charges, aerial bombs, or the crushing pressure of the deep Atlantic. Some found religion. Others found fatalism. A few found nothing but the numb acceptance of men who'd already died but hadn't yet stopped moving. And finally, for a few, came acceptance. Though acceptance is perhaps too gentle a word for what they experienced. It was more like the recognition that a condemned man feels when he stops counting days and simply exists in the eternal present of his cell. The most honest commanders acknowledged that they were no longer warriors but targets, that every patrol was simply a question of timing, that the Atlantic had become a graveyard that hadn't finished filling. Throughout this psychological evolution, one physical object appeared repeatedly in the testimony of German submariners: the Funkgerät, the radio receiver that initially gave false comfort and later confirmed their worst fears. In the early days, commanders would monitor Allied frequencies hoping to intercept convoy routing information. The radio represented intelligence, advantage, the hunter's knowledge of prey. But as the war progressed, that same radio became an instrument of terror. They listened to the increasing coordination between Allied aircraft and escort vessels, heard the calm professional voices directing assets toward U-boat positions, understood that they were being tracked with a precision that made stealth irrelevant. Junker, the commander from that March night in 1943, kept a journal that survived the war. His early entries overflow with confidence, technical discussions of attack angles, calculations of torpedo spreads, pride in successful sinkings. But as months progressed, the tone shifted. He wrote less about tactics and more about survival. He described the sound the radio made when scanning for radar emissions, a soft hiss like sand pouring through an hourglass, each grain another second of life or death. He noted how his men's hands trembled when operating the detection equipment, how they started at every alarm, how they jumped at shadows and phantom signals. The radio, once a tool of aggression, had become a totem of vulnerability, a constant reminder that somewhere in the darkness, Allied radar waves were searching, always searching, invisible fingers probing the night for German steel. The technological sophistication of Allied radar impressed even those who died by it. German intelligence eventually captured examples and dissected them with professional admiration. The cavity magnetron, developed by British scientists and mass-produced by American industry, generated microwave frequencies with unprecedented power and precision. Mounted in the nose of a consolidated B-24 Liberator, or beneath the wings of a short Sunderland flying boat, these systems could detect a submarine's conning tower from 30 kilometers away in complete darkness. The resolution was sufficient to distinguish a U-boat from driftwood or whale. The reaction time was measured in seconds. What astonished German engineers wasn't just the technology's effectiveness, but its proliferation. This wasn't a prototype reserved for special operations. By 1943, virtually every Allied aircraft in the Atlantic carried radar. Every escort vessel mounted it. The coverage was so comprehensive that U-boats could transit from one radar envelope to another without ever escaping detection. The Allies had industrialized submarine hunting with the same ruthless efficiency they applied to bomber production and tank manufacturing. It was American abundance meeting German desperation, and the outcome was never in doubt. German submariners developed a grudging respect for their hunters that transcended nationality. They recognized in Allied radar operators a professional competence that matched their own. The aircraft that tracked them through darkness weren't piloted by amateurs. The destroyers that prosecuted contacts with depth charges weren't commanded by incompetence. These were skilled mariners employing superior tools with lethal precision. Several surviving commanders noted in post-war interviews that they never felt hatred toward individual Allied personnel, only a kind of exhausted acknowledgement that they were fighting an enemy who'd mastered the very element that was supposed to protect submarines. The ocean, vast and deep and dark, had betrayed them. The transformation of U-boat doctrine in response to radar reveals how technology reshapes not just tactics but entire military cultures. Pre-radar submarine warfare emphasized audacity and aggression. Commanders were selected for their willingness to take risks, to press home attacks through escort screens, to maximize damage regardless of danger. The most successful captains, men like Otto Kretschmer and Günther Prien, were celebrated for their boldness. But radar rewarded different traits: caution, patience, the ability to remain submerged for extended periods despite crew discomfort and operational constraints. The new calculus favored survival over victory. Better to return with empty torpedo tubes than to die attempting an attack that radar would detect before weapons were launched. This fundamental shift demoralized commanders who'd built their identities around aggressive warfare. They felt diminished, reduced from predators to prey, from warriors to fugitives. Several chose to die attacking rather than embrace the careful defensiveness that radar demanded. Their boats vanished into the Atlantic, taking their crews and their obsolete courage to graves unmarked except by Admiralty records. By late 1944, some U-boat commanders openly questioned whether continued operations made any sense. The strategic justification had evaporated. Merchant sinkings had declined to the point where they no longer meaningfully impacted Allied logistics. Meanwhile, U-boat losses remained catastrophic. Nearly 800 submarines destroyed over the course of the war, taking 28,000 men to the bottom. The kill ratio had inverted so completely that each patrol accomplished nothing except the death of German sailors. Dönitz continued ordering boats to sea, invoking duty and discipline, and the need to tie down Allied resources. But even he recognized the fundamental futility. The submarine war had become a slow-motion execution, where the condemned were required to participate in their own deaths. What sustained men under such conditions? Not ideology. Very few U-boat crews were fervent Nazis, and Hitler's speeches rang hollow at 150 meters depth, with depth charges detonating overhead. Not hope of victory. By 1943, even the most optimistic recognized that Germany was losing. Instead, they endured through bonds of comradeship and the simple human stubbornness that refuses to surrender even when surrender would be rational. Junker wrote in his journal that he continued because his crew trusted him, and to give up would betray that trust. Others spoke of not wanting to die alone, of finding meaning in shared suffering, of the strange comfort that comes from facing death alongside men who have become brothers. It was the oldest motivation in warfare. Loyalty not to nation or cause, but to the man standing beside you in the darkness. The physical toll of radar-driven anti-submarine warfare manifested in ways both obvious and subtle. Obviously, there were the deaths, the explosions that crushed hulls or flooded compartments, the slow suffocation when damaged boats couldn't surface, the freezing Atlantic claiming those who survived sinkings but couldn't reach lifeboats. Less obviously, there was the psychological attrition that accumulated patrol after patrol. Men developed facial tics, insomnia, compulsive behaviors. Some lost the ability to tolerate confined spaces even temporarily. Others became hypersensitive to sound, jumping at innocuous noises, unable to differentiate between the normal creaks of a pressure hull and the precursors of catastrophic failure. German naval medicine had no vocabulary for combat stress or post-traumatic syndrome, so these conditions went undiagnosed and untreated. Men simply broke, and when they broke, they were quietly transferred to shore billets where they couldn't infect others with their fear. Among the most poignant documents in U-boat archives are letters written by commanders to families of lost crew members. They follow a formula: brave service, honorable death, sacrifice for the fatherland. But between the formal condolences, careful readers can detect something else: a desperate attempt at meaning-making, at constructing narrative purpose from senseless slaughter. These men died because Allied radar detected their submarines conning tower at 3 in the morning, and aircraft dropped bombs that no amount of courage could evade. What glory exists in that? What honor? The letters strained to provide answers that the writers themselves didn't believe. By war's end, surviving U-boat commanders had developed a dark fatalism that made them nearly useless for continued operations. Dönitz tried rotating crews more frequently, limiting patrol durations, improving shore leave facilities. Nothing worked. The psychological damage ran deeper than rest could cure. These were men who'd stared into the abyss of technological obsolescence and understood that human skill couldn't bridge the gap. No amount of training, experience, or determination could overcome the simple fact that Allied radar saw them before they could see their targets, struck them before they could strike back, killed them before they knew they were dead. The final patrols in April and May 1945 carried an air of surreal futility. Germany was obviously collapsing. Soviet armies fought in Berlin's streets. Allied forces crossed the Rhine and raced toward Bavaria. Yet U-boats still put to sea, still hunted convoys that no longer needed protection because the Reich they served was already ashes. Some commanders received orders to surrender at sea. Others were directed to Argentine ports where die-hard Nazis fantasized about continuing resistance from South American exile. A few simply scuttled their boats and scattered their crews, preferring Atlantic graves to capture or the chaos of post-war Europe. Werner, the surviving commander, wrote in his memoir that the last patrol felt like sailing through a dream, or rather, a nightmare from which waking was impossible. Orders came from headquarters that no longer existed. They hunted enemies who'd already won. They followed procedures designed for a war that had ended except in their own minds. When British destroyers finally intercepted U-953 and demanded surrender, Werner described feeling not relief but anticlimax. He'd survived not through skill but through timing, the dumb luck of still being alive when fighting stopped. In post-war interrogations, captured U-boat commanders spoke freely about Allied radar, no longer constrained by security classifications or false hope. Their testimony provides the clearest window into what they really thought. Almost universally, they expressed astonishment at the technology's effectiveness and the speed of its deployment. Several noted that German radar development had focused on longer wavelengths suitable for naval gunnery direction, missing entirely the potential of centimetric systems for detection. This wasn't stupidity. German scientists understood the physics perfectly well. Rather, it reflected institutional priorities and resource limitations. The Third Reich simply couldn't match Allied research spending or industrial capacity, particularly after 1942, when American factories began operating at full wartime production. More interesting than the technical discussions were the emotional admissions. Commanders acknowledged feeling helpless in ways that violated their self-conception as officers and warriors. They'd been trained to solve problems through intelligence, courage, and skill. But radar removed those variables from the equation. It didn't matter how clever your attack plan was if aircraft detected you before you reached firing position. Courage meant nothing when depth charges fell from invisible aircraft. Skill couldn't evade weapons guided by technology that saw through darkness and distance. For men who defined themselves through mastery of their profession, radar represented a kind of death before death, the negation of identity, the proof that everything they'd learned and practiced had become obsolete. A few commanders exhibited what psychologists might recognize as traumatic bonding with their Allied counterparts. They spoke admiringly of specific aircraft or escort commanders who'd hunted them, analyzing tactics with professional appreciation, discussing near misses with the enthusiasm of students examining case studies. This wasn't Stockholm Syndrome exactly, but rather the recognition that hunter and hunted shared more with each other than either shared with civilians who'd never faced death in the Atlantic darkness. The men who operated Allied radar understood U-boat capabilities and limitations intimately. They'd studied German doctrine, anticipated German responses, learned to think like the enemy. In a perverse way, they knew U-boat commanders better than headquarters staffs did. The recurring radio receiver appears one final time in these testimonies. Several commanders mentioned keeping their medocs or later detection equipment even after war's end, taking them home as souvenirs or talismans. Junker, interviewed in 1962, admitted he still owned the radio receiver from U-532. He kept it in a desk drawer, occasionally taking it out to examine. The interviewer asked why he'd retained something so associated with fear and death. Junker paused before answering. Because, he said, it reminded him that certainty is illusion, that technology transforms everything, that what seems impossible today becomes routine tomorrow. The radio had promised safety through early warning. Instead, it had merely provided seconds of advance notice before death. But those seconds had mattered. Sometimes they'd been enough. The story of what German U-boat commanders thought about Allied radar is ultimately a story about the collision between doctrine and technology, between human courage and industrial might, between what warriors believed war should be and what it actually became. They didn't think about radar in abstract terms. They thought about it in the sudden glare of searchlights splitting darkness, in the whistle of falling bombs, in the faces of crew members whose trust they couldn't protect, in the mathematics of attrition that made every patrol a countdown to death. They thought about it every time they surfaced into night that offered no cover. They thought about it in the silence before alarms, in the endless submerged hours when battery power dwindled and air grew foul. They thought about it when writing letters that might never be delivered, when looking at photographs of families they might never see again, when confronting the simple truth that skill and courage had become insufficient. Most of all, they thought about radar as a window into the future of warfare, a future where technology mattered more than human qualities, where industrial capacity trumped tactical brilliance, where the side with better